Welcome back. Today, we're taking a trip into the world of Harry Potter and his son, Albus, as he embarks on his own scary adventure. If you enjoy stories like this and want more in the future, consider subscribing and tapping the bell to be notified when new stories go live every single week. For now, lay back, relax, and enjoy the story. The whispers began in autumn. They were faint at first, little more than the sigh of wind through Hogwarts' ancient battlements, a sound Albus Potter had known his entire life. But these sounds were different. They didn't come from the wind or the groaning timbers of the castle. They came from inside his own head, coiling in the quiet moments between classes, or in the dead of night when the Slytherin dormitory was a tomb of silver and green light. They tasted of dust and forgotten things, of magic so old that it soured in the stone. At first, he told himself it was the pressure. Being the son of Harry Potter was a weight that settled on his shoulders the day he was born, and had only grown heavier with time. Every professor looked at him with an expectation he could never meet, every student with a mixture of awe and pity. He was an echo of a legend, a living relic of a war he'd never fought. James had worn the legacy like a crown, brash and confident. Lily wore it like a favorite cloak, easy and comfortable. But on Albus, it was a shroud. The whispers knew this. They spoke of his solitude, of the shadow he lived in. They promised him a name of his own, carved not in the annals of heroism, but in the very fabric of magic itself. He tried to ignore them. He'd spend more time with Scorpius, forcing laughter during games of exploding snap, losing himself in the intricate dance of potion making. But the whispers were patient. They would wait, and when his friend was gone, when the last drop of Gerderoot infusion was bottled, they would return. Over time, they grew bolder. They began to show him things. A fleeting glimpse of a twisted face in the reflection of a window pane as the Hogwarts Express thundered through the countryside. The portraits on the walls would seem to shift as he passed, their painted eyes following him with a malevolent intelligence, their smiles curling into sneers. He would see movement in the dark corners of the dungeons, skittering things that vanished when he turned his head. He started sleeping less, and when he did, his dreams were feverish landscapes of crumbling towers and screaming mouths. He'd wake up clawing at his sheets, the phantom feeling of cold, dry fingers on his skin. He grew gaunt in time. His green eyes, so like his father's and his mother's before him, becoming ringed with dark circles. He pushed Scorpius away, his irritability a thorny wall against his friend's concerned questions. He couldn't explain what exactly was happening. How could he say the castle itself hated him, that it was speaking to him, offering him a terrible, beautiful power? He sounded insane. He felt insane. One night, the whispers guided him. It was no longer a suggestion, but a command, a silken thread pulling him from his bed. He moved through the sleeping castle like a ghost, his feet silent on the cold flagstones. The whispers led him past the snoring portraits and the clanking, empty suits of armor, down to the library. The great oak doors were locked, but the whispers showed him the weakness in the ancient wards, a place where the magic had frayed thin like old cloth. A muttered word, a word he didn't know he knew, and the lock clicked open. He was in the restricted section. The air here was thick and heavy, smelling of decaying paper and dark intent. The whispers grew to a chorus, a symphony of temptation and promise, guiding his hand to a single book on a high shelf. It was bound not by leather, but in something that looked unnervingly like flayed skin, stretched, taut and dry. There was no title. As his fingers touched the cover, a jolt, sharp and cold, shot up his arm. The whispers fell silent. For the first time in weeks, there was quiet in his head. And in that silence, a new feeling bloomed. A terrifying, exhilarating sense of purpose. He tucked the book under his robes and slipped back into the shadows of the castle. A boy carrying his own damnation. The book was a thing of pure evil. The script was a jagged, spidery scrawl written in dried, brownish ink that Albus knew instinctively was blood. The diagram squirmed on the page as if he had stared too long, and the spells it described were abominations, twisting the very laws of nature into cruel new shapes. It was a grimoire of unmaking, of peeling back the layers of a soul to feast on what lay beneath. And at its heart was a ritual that promised to burn away the name Potter and forge a new identity from the ashes, an identity built on pure, untethered power. The whispers returned, no longer coy but demanding. They were the voice of the book, the will of the ancient, hungry thing trapped within its pages. It laid out the price for its gifts. 3 ingredients, 3 acts of desecration. The first was a petrified heart, not a stone but the literal heart of a creature turned to stone by the gaze of a basilisk. The whispers laughed, a dry, rustling sound in his mind. They knew where one lay. Getting into the Chamber of Secrets was easier than it should have been. The castle, now an extension of the book's will, seemed to help him. A bathroom conveniently empty, a faucet uncharacteristically stiff. The single word of a parcel tongue felt alien on his tongue, a snake uncoiling in his throat. The tunnel was a gullet of filth and bone, and the chamber itself was a carnivorous tomb. The great shedding skin of the basilisk lay like a collapsed cathedral, and its skeleton was a monument to a forgotten battle. Albus felt a flicker of what might have been awe, quickly extinguished by the cold purpose that now drove him. He found the carcass of a rat near the statue of Slytherin, its body perfectly preserved, turned to stone mid-scamper. Using the severed charm he had learned in the grimoire, a brutal, nasty piece of magic that tore rather than cut, he ripped the tiny heart from the creature's chest. It was stone and cold and heavy in his palms, a piece of stolen death. The second ingredient was the shadow of a scream. The book described it as the echo of pure terror, imprinted on a living thing. The whispers led him to the forbidden forest. They guided him past the acromantula layers and the wary centaur patrols, deep into the gnarled, choking heart of the woods. He was to find a boggart, not to banish it with laughter, but to feed it, let it gorge on his deepest fear until it became so saturated with his terror that a part of it would break off, a solidified piece of nightmare. His fear wasn't dementors or spiders, it wasn't even the spectre of Voldemort. When the boggart shifted before him, it took the form of his father. But not the kind, weary man he knew. This Harry Potter was cloaked in disappointment. His face was cold, his famous scar a livid line of judgment. The boggart opened its mouth, but it was his father's voice that came out, flat and empty. "You were never enough, Albus. You were always the weakest of them." The words were like a physical blow. Albus fell to his knees, a sob tearing from his throat, a raw, ragged sound of a heart breaking. He fed the creature his despair, his lifelong feeling of inadequacy, his secret shame. He let it drink until he was hollowed out, a shell of a boy kneeling in the mud. The boggart swelled, its form flickering between his father's disappointed face and a swirling vortex of shadow. Then, with a sickening pop, a small crystalline shard, black as obsidian, fell to the floor. The shadow of a scream. As Albus picked it up, he didn't feel relief. He felt nothing at all. The part of him that could feel hurt was gone, condensed into the shard in his hand. The final ingredient was the most terrible, a willing sacrifice of blood. Not his own, but the blood of one who shared his, given freely out of love. The book was clear. The sacrifice wasn't about murder. It was about betrayal. He found his brother, James, near the Quidditch pitch, bragging to his friends. Albus called to him, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, thin and distant. He spun a tale of a complex potion, a final project for Slughorn that required a drop of familial blood. James, ever arrogant but fiercely protective of his little brother, in his own way, rolled his eyes but agreed without a second thought. He trusted him. He held out his hand and Albus produced a small silver dagger, one of many instruments detailed in the grimoire. As Albus made the tiny cut on his brother's palm, James winced and then grinned. Albus felt the final piece of his old self wither and die. He collected the crimson drops in a vial, the love and trust in his brother's eyes burning him worse than any fire. He had his sacrifice, and he had his final price. He chose the room of requirement. He didn't ask it for a place to hide, but a place to be reborn. The room obliged, forming a circular chamber of black, unmarked stone, like the inside of a skull. There was no furniture, save for a single altar in the center. The air was cold and still, absorbing all sound. It was a place outside of Hogwarts, outside the world. A womb for a monster. He laid the ingredients on the altar, the stone heart, the shard of his own terror, and the vial of his brother's loving blood. He drew the ritual circle on the floor with chalk, the symbols from the book flowing from his memory as if he'd known them for centuries. They were glyphs of pain and severance, of endings and horrifying new beginnings. As he completed the circle, it began to glow with a sickly violet light, pulsing like a diseased heart. He stepped into the center, the book opened before him on the altar. The whispers rose to a deafening roar in his mind. the entity within the book straining against its prison, eager for the release he was about to grant it. He began the incantation. The words were like a blasphemy, a language of twisting flesh and splintering bone. The magic gathered in the room, a physical presence that pressed down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. The stone heart on the altar cracked, releasing a puff of grey dust that smelled of ancient decay. The shard of terror dissolved into black smoke, slithering into his mouth and nostrils, choking him with his own despair. And finally he uncorked the vial of blood. As he tipped it onto the altar, the crimson liquid didn't spill. It rose into the air, forming a single, perfect sphere. It began to pulse with the light of the circle. This was the key. The betrayal. The love he had, twisted into a tool for his own ascension. He spoke the final words of the ritual, a name that had not been uttered in a millennia. The world shattered. Pain, white hot and absolute, consumed him. It felt as if every bone in his body was breaking. Every inch of his skin was being flayed from his muscles. It was being unmade. His soul torn apart, thread by thread. He saw his life flash before him, his mother's smile, his first trip on the Hogwarts Express, Scorpius's easy friendship, his father's proud hand on his shoulder. He screamed as the memories were burned away, turned to ash by the violet fire of the ritual. He was a vessel being hollowed out. The entity from the book poured into him, a flood of ancient consciousness, of timeless hunger and profound cruelty. The last thing to go was his name, Albus. It vanished in a final agonizing pop of light. And then there was only the cold, immense, and eternal new self. When Harry Potter finally entered the room, the door appearing for him only when the ritual was complete, he felt dread colder than any Dementor's kiss. The chamber was quiet. The circle on the floor was faded. The altar, empty save for a book bound in skin, which crumbled to dust as he watched. In the center of the room stood his son. He looked the same. The same messy black hair, the same slender frame. He wore his Slytherin robes. But as he turned, Harry's breath hitched in his chest. The face was Albus's, but it was a flawless, placid mask, and the eyes, the familiar green eyes, were gone. In their place were orbs of pure and depthless black, devoid of warmth or light. They held an intelligence that was ancient and utterly alien. The thing wearing his son's face smiled. It was a small, calm, terrible smile that didn't reach his eyes. There was no reunion, no shouted questions, no duel. There was only the crushing silence of the stone room and the awful finality in those black eyes. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the vanquisher of the Dark Lord, stood before his middle child and felt, for the first time since he was a boy, true and absolute terror. He was no longer looking at his son. He was looking at a thing that had eaten him from the inside out. He was looking at the end of everything he had ever fought for, and it was wearing his own family's face. The whispers were gone. They no longer needed to speak from the shadows. They were here now, looking right at him, and they had all the time in the world. That's it for this story. If you're still with us, consider checking out another one of our adventures. YouTube should have put a couple of them on screen for you. And of course, consider subscribing for more calm and slightly scary weekly stories just like this. Farewell, my wonderful heroes.